right, everybody, let's get started. So everyone has a seat, so your notebooks out, wrap up your conversations. So I left us on a cliffhanger at the end of last class. For the next, 20, 30 minutes, we will be talking about the weirdest stuff in all of intro psychology. So just be patient. It is kind of amusing. It's a little bit hard for me to get through it with a straight face. Maybe hard for you all as well. Although having said that, we will also be talking about some ideas from Freud that I think are defensible and that do have empirical support, namely the defense mechanisms. My supervisor and I actually worked on a paper about defense mechanisms. There is, something in those ideas, but some of the other stuff is pretty crazy. So what this section starts off with is Freud's core insight, his big new idea. It's not entirely new. There were some people before who had talked about this, but he was the first to talk about it in great depth. And that's the idea of unconscious mental processing. That is the idea for which Freud is most famous. He distinguishes between three levels of mental events: conscious mental events, pre-conscious mental events, and unconscious. So very briefly, the distinction here, sometimes this is shown on like an iceberg. So an iceberg, most of it is under the surface. The part that's above the surface, in the light, would be the conscious level. So everything that you are currently thinking about would fall in the conscious level. So right now, most of you, hopefully, are conscious of the words that I'm saying. You're conscious of what you can see, the visual scene in front of you. Maybe you're conscious of the pressure from the shitty chairs. All of that would be, stuff that you are currently thinking about. The pre-conscious level is things that you are not currently thinking about, but you could be. So 10 minutes ago, you were probably not thinking about the name of your English teacher from grade 12. And now you all are, if you had such a teacher, or at least if you remember their name. So the name of your grade 12 English teacher 10 minutes ago would have been here. And now it's here. Now you're thinking about it. And then within 10 minutes, you will have forgotten about them, and they will have gone back to the pre-conscious level. And then the unconscious level is everything that is systematically inaccessible to consciousness. There are different reasons why things would be there. The most basic one is repression, which we'll talk about later. That's the idea that we push some memories and thoughts and desires into the unconscious. Freud thought that elements of the unconscious would make their way out indirectly, for example, through things like Freudian slips, which is when you accidentally say something that you were sort of unconsciously thinking about, and also through dreams. Freud thought that dreams were the window onto the unconscious. An important idea in the way that Freud thinks about psychology is this idea of psychic energy. Freud was inspired by various machines like the steam engine. He thought that the mind was full of this energy and that it needed to be released. So we talked about catharsis last time, right? That's like, having an outlet for your aggressive tendencies. That would be an example of psychic energy, in this case, aggressive psychic energy that needs to be released. Another distinction. Now, this distinction is different from the distinction between conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. Don't worry about trying to map them together. There is a way to do it. And actually, the video I'm going to show disagrees with the textbook. So we're not going to worry about mapping these on. But in terms of the human personality, Freud also thought that there were three basic components. And this is, again, a different distinction than the conscious, preconscious, unconscious distinction. Freud thought that the human personality broke down into three components. The first is the id. This is kind of a silly translation. The German, if you translate it literally, just means it, I-T. This is the kind of animalistic part of the human person. So just raw animal desire. For food, for warmth, for sex, for aggression, all of that is contained in the id. When babies are born, according to Freud, they are all id. They have nothing else. As they grow up a little bit, or I should say that the id is governed by the pleasure principle, according to Freud. So the id is just me, 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 I want, I want. It's a very stupid component of the human person. The ego, and again, the word in German just means I. Not the word I, but like the letter I, like the self. The ego is just the self. And the ego is governed by the reality principle. What kids start to discover as they grow up is you can't always get what you want. Sometimes you have to use self-control, right? In the real world, you can't just always get instant satisfaction. You have to negotiate with the world. You have to sometimes be patient. You sometimes have to ask strategically, and so on. So that's what the ego, or how the ego emerges. And then the last one to develop is the superego. And again, in German, that would just be super I. And this is our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong, that we learn from our parents, from our culture, and from our community. By the way, Freud thought that girls never fully developed a superego. So he was a man of his time. He was kind of sexist. I mean, if anything, wouldn't it be, well, I would say that. So the way this would play itself out in an ordinary decision, so let's say that you're married and you have a job and the hot secretary who works for you is hitting on you. The id would say, yes, cheat on your wife, do it. The superego would say, no, that's morally wrong. And then the ego has to make the decision. Right? Remember, the ego is the self. So the ego has to kind of decide between these two conflicting components of the human person. Okay. Before we move on into the defense mechanisms, any questions about these three ingredients? So, as I say, the ego is the self, and one thing that you confront in your life is various pieces of unpleasant information, right? Lots of bad news. And the ego's first resort is to try to fix the problem, right? Try to develop strategies to deal with the bad situation that has emerged. But in some cases, there's really no way to deal with it. And this can be very anxiety-inducing, right? And so what the ego develops is a set of defense mechanisms. These are strategies for dealing with unpleasant information. And as I say, I think there's actually a lot of insight in a lot of these. Some of them are very similar to the idea of self-serving bias that we saw in a previous chapter. They are various thinking patterns that are designed to protect the self against negative or unpleasant information. The first is repression. This is the most basic one. Repression is when you take an unpleasant thought or desire or memory and push it away into the unconscious. So you repress it. So that's the most basic one. A similar one is denial. So you just don't accept the unpleasant truth. Repression would mean you don't even think about it. You just push it away into the unconscious. Denial would mean you believe it's not true. Displacement. This is when you have an emotional response to someone, typically someone who it would not be appropriate to show that response to. So let's say you have a job, you're really pissed off at your boss. You can't scream at your boss, right? You'll get fired. So you go home, you scream at your little brother, because he's a safer target. So you take that usually negative emotion and redirect it towards someone who's a safer target. Intellectualization. You have some unpleasant experience and you turn it into a cold research project. You don't want to face the emotions or deal with those, so you just make it a cognitive problem. So let's say you get fired, you're really sad, and rather than confront the sadness, you study unemployment or the economy or something, just to change your problem into a cognitive and therefore tractable problem. Projection. This is when you have a certain emotion and you assume someone else has it. You project it onto them. This is different from displacement, where you're redirecting the emotion and showing it to someone, like you're mad at your boss and then you get mad at your brother. This would be like, let's say it's the same thing. You go home and you're pissed off at your boss, and you look around how everyone's behaving. Let's say you see your brother fidgeting with his thumbs. And you think, my brother looks really irritated, looks kind of angry. But really, he's not. You're just projecting your emotion onto him. Rationalization. This is when a negative event occurs, and you try to tell yourself a story in which the event is not actually negative, it's positive. I believe people of your generation call this copium or something. So that's what this would be. You get dumped, and you say, no, this is good, it frees me up to meet new people, or whatever. That would be rationalization. Reaction formation. This is when you behave in a way that displays an emotion that's the opposite of what you actually feel. So classic example, I think someone asked about this in an earlier chapter. Grade 7 boy likes a girl. what does he do? Pulls her hair, calls her ugly, does all these sorts of things. And then if you ask, hey, Tommy, do you like Susie? No, I hate her. And the only person who believes that is Tommy. Everyone else knows what's going on. Really funny study about this. As I mentioned, some of these do have some empirical support. I gotta be careful how I describe this one because I could get in trouble. But this is one of the funniest studies ever done. Maybe not the funniest, but it's definitely up there. They got a bunch of guys into the lab, and they hooked up a certain part of their body to something that measured blood flow. And they asked them a bunch of questions about what they thought about homosexuality, like how homophobic were they. And then they showed them gay porn. This is a real study. And what they found was the people who were the most homophobic had the most blood flow during the gay porn. So the guys, that's disgusting, that's terrible. In fact, this is a great study to use in arguments with people. If someone's like kind of homophobic, you're like, hey man, why are you so angry about this? It's a good way to shut down the argument. I was texting my gay friend this morning. I mentioned I was going to say this in class. He's also an instructor, so I was like, hey, guess what I'm talking about? So that's reaction formation. The last one, which is widely thought to be the healthiest defense mechanism to use, is sublimation. So sublimation is when you take some kind of negative energy or anxiety and redirect it towards doing something productive, or at least to doing something else. So again, there's lots of reels about this. This is the classic, guy gets rejected and like goes to the gym and works out even harder. That would be an example of sublimation.
Sorry, could you repeat that last one?
Yeah, so sublimation, you take whatever the negative emotion is, anxiety, hurt, whatever, and you redirect it towards doing something productive. So again, someone, or it could be anything you're upset about. Or you're upset about something and you study harder, or you work harder at the gym, whatever your target behavior is. One that's not testable, it's not listed in the book, but I'll mention it in case it comes up in your future classes, is regression. Not repression, but regression. This is when you're confronted with negative emotions of some kind, and you go back to a more childish type of behavior. You find your favorite stuffed animal from when you were a kid, or you watch comfort shows, or whatever. Some more childish kind of behavior as a way of coping with negative emotions. Though, as I say, that one's not in the book, so don't worry about it in the test. Okay. Any questions about the defense mechanisms? Yep.
How is intellectualization different than sublimation?
That's a good question. You could think of intellectualization as almost a type of sublimation, but it's specifically you're turning the problem into a cognitive or intellectual problem. I mean, you could do that even, I guess, without doing research. You could just be sitting at home, not opening a book, and thinking, what are the factors that influence unemployment? Like, say, if you got fired, and just thinking about it in those terms. Whereas sublimation is actually doing something, like redirecting it towards working out or studying or something else. But good question. Any other questions? Yes.
You said sublimation is thought to be the healthiest coping mechanism. Why is that?
Yeah, that's what the book says. One thing my professor said, and this is a little bit speculative, there's a few assumptions being made here, but one piece of evidence you could cite, men on average are more likely to do things like this. So when faced with upsetting news, they're more likely to distract themselves and to engage in things like that, whereas women are more likely on average to ruminate, like just to go over in their head the negative emotion. and women are on average more susceptible to getting depression and other things like that. Now that's not particularly strong evidence because of course there are other differences. That's one thing that I've heard my professors cite. We'll actually talk a bit more about this in the coping section, but I won't test you on which of these is the best. I just mentioned that as an aside. Just make sure you know what they. Other questions?
You say that some patients that when it's it goes to just address if it's something serious that needs to be addressed and they don't address it.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an area of controversy, right? Like, if you don't address the quote underlying issue, will that lead to more of the, will the problem stay if you don't address the underlying issue? And there actually is some evidence that not so much sublimation, but repression can be unhealthy, that it can make the problem worse over time. But there are some therapeutic techniques that we'll see in chapter 17 where they don't really care about getting to the underlying deep issue. It's more, okay, like you're sad now, let's make you less sad. So different people may give different answers to that. Yes.
Did Freud say that a person does like one of these coping mechanisms at one time, or?
Oh, I think you would say most people do most of these at some point. These are all common techniques he thought that were used by.
For like of one particular situation, do they use multiple of these, or just?
Oh, sure, you can. There's no contradiction in Freud's thinking. Yeah, it's possible to use more than one for the same problem. Yeah. Okay, so that's all, as I say, sensible enough. Now we get to the really weird stuff. And that's Freud's theory of child development. Oh, actually, before that, I forgot to show a video. So I mentioned that there's these three components to the human person. Here is a great, 30-second video of a baby who is all id. So as I say, just pure id, no ego. So as I say though, the weirdest part of Freud is the stuff about child development. I will note, Freud never did any empirical studies with children. So he pulled this out of something. So the way that Freud's theory of child development works is there are a set of stages. Each stage is associated with an erogenous zone, which is a center of psychosexual energy. And each stage has a kind of normal way of going through it. And if you fail to go through it in the normal way, you will become fixated. You will stay at that zone will stay an erogenous zone into adulthood and lead to various problems. So each stage is named after what the erogenous zone is. And the stages are as follows: the oral stage, the anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, and general stage. If you want an easy way to remember, old age people like grapes. So there you go. That helps. That's one way to get the order. And the ages for these are around 0 to 2. Is it 2 to 3, the next one? Yeah, 2 to 3. 4 to 6. 6 to 12-ish. And then 12, or whenever puberty occurs, till death. That's the last one. So the first stage, the erogenous zone, is the mouth. This is when breastfeeding, of course, is occurring. And it is true, at this stage, kids do try to put everything in their mouth. Walking around, putting stuff in their mouth, and so on. So Freud thought that The big difficulty during this stage is weaning, right? Getting off of breast milk. If you do not go through this stage properly, you will develop an oral fixation. And this means that when you're an adult, you'll have various problems related to this. So like maybe you overeat or undereat, maybe you start smoking, become an alcoholic, whatever, some mouth-related problem. So if you go into Freud's office, and you say, "Doc, I really can't stop smoking," he would say, "How did your mother breastfeed you?" So that's how Freud thought about that. With the anal stage, the big conflict during this stage is toilet training. So learning how to control yourself. You may remember Erikson's stages. Erikson was actually inspired by this. He just got rid of some of the weird sex stuff, which is coming up next. But Freud and Erikson agreed that was the big conflict in ages 2 and 3, is learning to control yourself. So it's all about learning self-control. And here, if you don't go through it properly, there's 2 kinds of fixation. There's anal retentive fixation or anal expulsive fixation. Anal retentive means you grew up to be too controlling. You're kind of OCD, too organized, too neat and tidy to the point where it's like a problem. And anal expulsive is the opposite. You're completely undisciplined, your room's always a mess, you can't keep a schedule, don't show up to work on time, that kind of thing. That would be anal expulsive. And so again, if you show up to the clinic and it's a Freudian, it's an analyst, you're really disorganized, Freud will say, must have something to do with your toilet training. Based on his exactly 0 hours dealing with children. The phallic stage, ages 4 through 6, this is when children discover their gender. They realize, I'm a boy, or I'm a girl. And this causes conflict in the family. And the conflict takes a different form depending on whether you're a boy or a girl. If you're a boy, you go through the Oedipus complex. And if you're a girl, you go through the Electra complex. These are similar, they're kind of parallel. If you're a boy, this is when you develop sexual feelings towards your mother. So, exactly. So very, very strange stuff. So you become into your mother, and you discover that your father has your mother, and therefore you're mad at him. So you hate your dad. Additionally, I wish I was making this up, Freud thought that during this stage, boys became afraid that their father would cut their penis off. This is called castration anxiety. Again, not making this up. This is named after the Greek myth, Oedipus. This is a story about a guy who was given away when he was a baby because the oracle said, this baby will grow up to marry his mother and kill his father. So they banish him as a baby. But then through a series of events, he winds up growing up and meeting his father in the street and dueling him and killing him. And then through another series of events, winds up marrying his mother, though he doesn't know it's his mother. And Freud thought, yeah, that's what we all want to happen when we're about 5 years old. The Electra complex is the equivalent for young girls. So they develop feelings for their father and hate their mother. They obviously don't have castration anxiety. The equivalent that they have is penis envy. They discover that they don't have that, and they become jealous. So that's pretty weird stuff. The way this stage is supposed to end is you're supposed to achieve something called identification, which is where you come to identify with your same-sex parent. So by the time you're like 6 or 7, you're supposed to think, Dad's, if you're a boy, Dad's not that bad. He's a boy like me. I want to grow up to be like him. I don't want to kill him anymore. And vice versa, if you're a girl, you should feel that way towards your mother. The latency stage, oh, the book says 7 to puberty. Whatever. Yeah. This is when latency means like dormant or asleep. So psychosexual energy kind of gets repressed. This is when you focus on developing non-sexual friendships. And then in puberty, the genitals are again the erogenous zone, and from here on in, you're supposed to have, quote, normal sexual desire, whatever that means. And that's how you're supposed to stay until you die. So that is the stages of child development according to Freud. Any questions? That was fast, yes.
Seems like there's a gap between 3 and 4 with the way that's written.
No, so like, well, actually, I want to check something quickly. Yes, there's overlap with 0 to 2, but the way the book says it is, it would be till like the end of 3. These, of course, aren't super sharp because, you know, people can be a little more, a little less. The same with, the book says 4 to 6 and then 7 to 12, but don't worry about that level of detail. I'll only pick the times where it's like in the middle, if I was going to ask a question about when a certain stage is.
Could you repeat latency?
Yeah, latency is when psychosexual energy is repressed and there's kind of nothing going on. This is when you're focusing on ordinary social relationships.
If you live in a single-parent household, does the phallic stage still go through?
Yeah, I suspect Freud would say that you don't go through the stage normally then. He had some weird theory of homosexuality where that stemmed from this stage. I forget the details, but I won't ask about something like that on the test. Okay, so as I say, this is the weirdest stuff in the book. I will note, I did once hear my parents were out hugging in the kitchen, and my sister said, "Hey, keep your hands off my dad." So that is one small anecdote. I actually have one kind of funny video where you do sometimes see kids doing this. So I have one compilation of kids getting mad at their parents kissing. Okay. So, that's all I have to say about the stages. Any questions about them before moving on to the neo-Freudians? So, as I've mentioned in other chapters, there are a number of what we call neo-Freudians. So these are people who, neo means like new or modified. So we've already seen one, Erik Erikson, back in the developmental chapter. There are a number of others who, some of them actually worked directly with Freud before breaking away with him. If you worked with Freud, you kind of had to agree with him 100%, or else he would kind of kick you out of the club. So that happened to a number of people. One who, as far as I know, did not work directly with Freud, and I forget how to pronounce her name. I'm pretty sure it's not what it looks like. Is this person. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced like Horneye or something, not what it sounds like, although whatever helps you memorize it. So she was a critic of many of the seemingly, not seemingly, many of the actually sexist aspects of Freud's theories. So she would have taken issue, for example, with the idea that women don't develop a superego. Another thing she put forward was the idea of womb envy. So she said it's not that girls have penis envy, boys have womb envy. They are jealous of the fact that women can give birth. Now, sample size of 1, I personally have never felt this, but that's what Karen thought. Another neo-Freudian is Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler thought that Freud was wrong to say that sex was the main human motivation. he thought that the drive for superiority was what really drove things. So we all want to be competent and better than others, and if we aren't, if we struggle to establish ourselves, we develop an inferiority complex. I think it's time for some new markers. That's what I've decided in this moment. So if you develop an inferiority complex, you will engage in compensation. You will engage in various things to kind of boost your self-esteem. This is that old joke, right? Someone who has a big truck is like insecure and engaging in compensation. That would be an Adlerian idea. So I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I used to work in a warehouse. And warehouse, you talk about stuff like that. And one guy at the warehouse pointed out that you never make the opposite inference. Like if someone has a big truck, you go, yeah, that guy's really insecure. But if a guy has a piece of shit car, you don't go, wow, that guy. It doesn't really work like that. So that's Alfred Adler. Probably the most famous neo-Freudian. But I think Adler, yeah, he did work directly with Freud. But as did the next guy. Wow, this is really is Carl Jung. And it is Jung, it's definitely not Jung. He had several ideas. One thing that he parted ways with Freud on is the subject of religion. Freud was a very hardcore atheist. He thought that religion was essentially wish fulfillment. You want like a big daddy in the sky kind of thing. Whereas Jung had more respect for religion. And one of his ideas was the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a set of themes, ideas, tendencies that are universal to the species, that all of us have. So for example, there are, Jung argues, certain religious themes and ideas that seem to be universal, that even in cultures that are not, that haven't had contact yet, there are ideas that seem to recur again and again. Ideas of the hero are also, according to him, universal. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is populated by what he called archetypes. Various themes and ideas that, again, are common to the world's cultures. And then the last neo-Freudian, you don't need to know any names with this one, but people called object relations theorists. It's kind of an odd name for it, but these people were the precursors to attachment theory. So they thought that what we did was, when we were kids, we develop an internal working model of what people are like. And we do so primarily on the basis of our parents. Right? So they agreed with Freud that early interactions with parents are very important for shaping who you are later, just without some of the weird stuff. And people like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, who we saw back in the development chapter, they were explicitly influenced by these people. They cited kind of the Freudian tradition as part of the basis for their work. But again, so what you should remember is they thought that we developed a kind of a model of what people are like, are they nice or not or whatever, based on how our parents treat us, and that serves as a model for how we interact with people when we grow up. Okay. There's then a section on kind of an evaluation of psychoanalytic theory and some of the problems. I mean, some of them should be kind of obvious, but before talking about that, just to sum up, since there's a few different people, I'm going to show a video from Crash Course that kind of summarizes the key points of Freud and the neo-Freudians. Okay, so that's a good review of all the stuff we talked about. The main, I mean, there have been several criticisms of Freud's theory, but one that's very important has to do with a term that I introduced on the first day, and that's the idea of falsifiability. So remember that I said that it's important that an idea that purports to be scientific be falsifiable. It be able to be proven wrong. And this has to do partly with how the scientists and the theorists themselves treat the theory, how they react when evidence comes up that goes against their theory. And people who worked with Freud and Adler and some of the other Freudians argued that this was a key shortcoming, that ideas in this tradition often are used in unfalsifiable ways. And I'll make it concrete. This is an example I gave in 104. So suppose you're trying to test the Oedipal complex, the idea that boys hate their father, or that aspect of the Oedipal complex. So you look at a boy and he hits his father. A Freudian will typically say, yes, that proves that he hates his father. But suppose he hugs his father. That's reaction formation. He's showing the opposite emotion of what he really feels. Okay, what about that boy? That boy is just playing with blocks. He's ignoring his father. That's sublimation. He's taking his hatred for his father and redirecting it into playing with blocks. And the problem should be obvious. No matter what the kid does, it's somehow evidence that the theory is right. And in order for it to be a scientific theory, it has to stick its neck out, at least somewhere. It has to make a risky prediction that at least could potentially be falsified. And then the last video of the Freud section, just a quick clip from the show House of someone using a Freudian idea in exactly this way, unfalsifiable. Okay, very nice example. And that closes off the Freudian section. So we'll now move on to, the next section is entitled The Humanist Perspective, but the first person in that section, George Kelly, denied that he was the humanist. So I'm going to treat George Kelly separately and then move into the humanist perspective. So I don't have too much to say about George Kelly. He is, as I say, sometimes classified, including in this book, as a humanist. He is sometimes classified as a cognitive psychologist. I think it's probably better to view him as an early cognitive psychologist. He denied that, or he said he wasn't either. He's like, I'm my own thing, bro. Don't put me in a bucket. So he said he was his own thing. His basic idea was that of personal constructs. He was around at the time when behaviorism was still fairly popular, and behaviorism, of course, emphasized behavior and contingencies in the environment having to do with reward and punishment. In other words, behaviorism, as you probably remember, had no place for mental events, or what people believe or feel or anything like that. But Kelly said, to understand what people do, you have to talk about what they believe. His fancy term for this was personal constructs. So different categories in their head, in their mind, that they put people into. So let's say you want to predict how someone will behave in a bus when they get tripped. They're walking along, someone's foot's in the way and they trip. What are they going to do next? Well, one thing you have to know, according to Kelly, and this seems quite reasonable, is how do they evaluate what the person did? Do they think they did it on purpose or not? And therefore, if they think they did it on purpose, they'll infer that's a bad guy, and now I'm mad at him. If it was an accident, they won't make that judgment, and therefore won't behave in an angry way towards it. That's just a simple example. And the core idea of Kelly is pretty simple, though at the time it was actually pretty controversial, given how popular behaviorism is. So for Kelly, all you need to worry about is this, the idea that people had these constructs like good or bad, and that they would evaluate people and situations in light of these constructs, and that impacted their behavior, right? So whether you think the guy tripped you on purpose or not will affect how you behave when you turn around after you've been tripped. Someone who definitely falls in the humanist category is Carl Rogers. So remember that the humanists, these are people who had a very optimistic vision of human nature. They emphasized free will and self-actualization, and I won't say they were anti-science, that's not the right way to say it, but they didn't like the kind of reductionistic approach of people like the behaviorists or even neuroscientists, people who tried to say that we're just machines. They said, no, we have free will, we're special, and should be striving towards self-actualization. And as I said, one of the most important people in this area is Carl Rogers. We'll actually come back to him in the chapter on therapy. He developed a type of therapy that draws on some of the ideas we'll talk about today. But according to Rogers, one of the early things to develop in a human is a self-concept. So, a sense of self. This is something that emerges over time. According to him, babies don't really have a sense of self. Actually, Freud would agree with that. They don't have a clear distinction between themselves and the environment. It's all just kind of a blur. But as you grow, you develop a sense of self. And there are two things that he thought a good self-concept should have. Self-consistency and congruence. So you have a self-concept, you have beliefs about what you're like. Self-consistency is about, within your self-concept, are there any contradictions? I'm going to make it really simple. Like, if you believe that you're smart and not smart, that would be a contradiction. Your self-concept is not consistent, not internally consistent. Congruence is the concept consistent with your experience, consistent with what you see as you live your life? You can think of it as being similar to two features of a scientific theory that a theory should have. Right? A scientific theory should be self-consistent, right? So it shouldn't be contradicting itself. But it should also be consistent with the data, right? With what you observe. That's what a good theory should have, both of those. And to show you what incongruity looks like, show a picture from the book. So you have your self-concept, and then you have your experience. And if they are not congruent, you have to engage either in distortion or denial. So the book has a funny example. You know, if you think you're a stud, you're really good with girls, but every time you ask someone out, it doesn't work out, that would be incongruous. You have self-consistency. You could be totally consistent within your head and think, yes, I am really good with women, but experience would be every time you try something, it doesn't work. So you have to either deny part of that experience or distort it. Like, no, man, she really wants me. She just, whatever, make up something. That would be distorting the experience. So according to Rogers, what you want is integration or congruence. You want your self-concept and your experience to be consistent with each other. that allows you to be a fully functioning self, which means you're not self-censoring or trying to change yourself. You're free and creative and can just, be genuine. You don't have to be trying to artificially create something that you are not. Rogers also believed in the importance of self-esteem. He's one of the ones who popularized the idea of self-esteem. And the book cites evidence that self-esteem is positively correlated with various good things, like social skills and happiness and other things. Now, we gotta remember correlation doesn't mean causation. One criticism of that work, because the way that work is sometimes used is, okay, self-esteem is correlated with these various things. So what we should do is increase self-esteem, and then people will be better at these various outcome measures. But of course, it could be that people who have higher self-esteem are actually better at those things, and that's why they're doing well, because correlation doesn't mean causation. So that's one criticism of that work. But the book does rightly cite that there is evidence that self-esteem positively correlates with these various good outcomes. Another important feature of Rogers' theory is the idea of need for positive regard, which is just a fancy way of saying love or acceptance. So if someone deals with you with positive regard, it means they're treating you well, they accept you, and so on. And he thought the right way to deal with people is to show them unconditional positive regard. The spelling's unconditional positive regard. So, meaning without conditions. So if your parents say, I will only love you if you get good grades, that would be conditional positive regard. It comes with conditions. Unconditional means you will accept someone no matter what they do. This is an important part of his therapy. And so one thing that Rogers advocated is that people also have positive self-regard. They not only accept others and treat them well, but accept themselves for what they are. And to not have too high, what he calls conditions of worth, which you could basically call conditions for self-regard, meaning like for yourself. Like, I have to do this or else I won't accept myself. He thinks that you should not artificially increase conditions of worth. So as I said, the goal for Rogers is to become a fully functioning person in which your self-concept and experience are congruous, they're consistent with each other, and you can be true to yourself. I'm not commenting whether I agree or disagree, this is just what Rogers' view is. So that's the end of the Rogers section. Any questions on him? Okay. Two types of biases that relate to the self that are actually somewhat conflicting, but there is some evidence for each of them in some context. One is self-verification, and the other is self-enhancement. I'll say first, self-enhancement is basically the same thing as self-serving bias in a previous chapter. So trying to evaluate information in a way that favors a positive view of the self. So if something goes well, you say it's because of your internal traits. If something goes badly, you say it's because of the situation. Sometimes psychologists make up multiple terms for basically the same thing. This is one of those cases. Self-verification is a funny concept. The idea here is, you can think of it as, it's essentially confirmation bias, but for your view of yourself. You will try to behave in ways that confirm whatever your self-image is. And the idea here is whether it's good or bad. So this is a bit of a different idea than self-enhancement. So if you have a particular self-concept, you will try to behave in ways that, or you will try to display traits that reflect what your self-concept is. Another expression of this is you will choose to be with people and in situations that tend to confirm your self-image. So one example the book gives, or I'll say that definition again. You will sometimes choose to be with people and in situations that confirm your self-image. That's one, not definition, but one consequence of self-verification. An example that the book gives is apparently people with a negative self-image, if they are with a romantic partner who treats them well, they are more likely to leave. They feel like it's not confirming their negative self-image. At least that's what the book says. There's one study apparently that found that. So that would be an example of something that the self-verification people would view as vindication of their theory. Okay. Next, we'll do a little activity. There's a section on cultural influences on the self, on self-concepts. If you're in my 104 class, you have already done this, but take a few minutes and either on your notepad or on your computer, write down a set of sentences that begin with the words I am. And they should be true. So true sentences that begin with the words I am. In the real version, you have to do 20. That takes too long. So try to get to like 6 or 7. I'll give like a few minutes, and then we'll do something with that. Okay, show of hands, who has more than 5? Okay, I'll give another like 10, 20 seconds, and then we'll discuss. Okay, with the ones you have, I want you to classify them into 2 groups. And there will be some judgment call in what counts as which. Don't worry too much about it. I'm not an expert in administering this test, so you may have to use your judgment, but researchers who use this categorize answers into 2 groups. 1, answers that have to do with your social identity or social situatedness. So I am a good friend, I am a student at the U of A, I am X ethnicity or from X country. Anything like that would be a social identity. It has to do with your relationship with other people. I am a son or daughter, those would obviously count too. And then all of the other ones that are kind of just about you, those would be in the second group. So use your judgment and categorize them into two groups, and then look at which bucket is bigger. Which has more answers. Okay, so show of hands, how many of you have more in the social identity bucket? How many of you have more in the other one? Oh wow, that's a much bigger effect than my 104 class. So this test has been used widely, and there is a cultural difference in how many answers people tend to give to these different buckets. So people in more collectivistic cultures, so like East Asian cultures, South Asian cultures, tend to give more social identity answers. Whereas people from individualistic countries like Western Europe or North America tend to give more answers that are just about you, like what your unique traits. So that's consistent with other ideas about what those cultures emphasize. So that's one interesting finding. Another thing that this section closes off with is the idea of gender schemas. So a schema is a concept, we've seen that term before. And the idea here is you develop a concept for what boys and girls are supposed to be like, how they're supposed to behave. This relates to some things we talked about in earlier chapters. And the idea is you will, as you grow up, tend to behave more in a way that's consistent with the gender schema. Of course, not always, but that's at least an effect that gender schemas may have. So that's the end of the section on gender, culture, and the self, which closes off the section on humanism and the self. Okay, so we have a little bit of time left. I'll just do a little bit of a teaser into the next section. So the next section is on what's probably the most popular nowadays approach to personality, and that's the trait approach. What we're going to see is people in this approach use that technique we saw back in chapter 10, factor analysis, where you look at people's responses to test items, in this case, personality questions, and you look at how they correlate with each other. And there are different approaches here where you can extract, using factor analysis, different traits that characterize people. A lot of them will be familiar to you, like extroversion is one you're going to see. So that's what we'll talk about next class, but we'll finish there a little early. So I'll see you all next class for the traits. Oh, and the APA assignment is due tonight, 11:59 p.m.